David Davis, thanks so much for joining us. Now, you were a backer of Kemi Badenoch. Let's kick off there. Why was that?
Well, because the world today and Britain today faces more problems than any time since about the 70s. I mean, the last two occasions when we had as many problems as the 70s, and then before that, the 30s. You know, war in Europe, Middle East in uproar, the great trade deal that the whole world adhered to since 1995 is falling to bits, whether you take China or America's influence. And at home, National Health Service isn't working. Welfare is paying people to sit at home doing nothing. Our education system, apart from reading, is not doing very well. Youngsters can't buy homes, but they end up with the equivalent of mortgages for their whole lives after going to university. You know, the whole series of really, really difficult problems. And I wanted somebody who I thought was clever enough and effective enough to attack all those problems, given we've got 4 years to come up with some answers.
Are you happy with the way her first week has gone?
Yeah, I mean, she's had a reasonably good start on PMQ. She nailed Starmer to the spot on his relationships with Trump, which are going to be really difficult because of Lammy, but also because of others. Angela Rayner hasn't exactly been flattering about them. So that's going to be a problem for him. And she hit that on the nail. She's got a shadow cabinet in place. She's going to be a unifying factor in a party which has been ripping itself apart for 4 years. So, you know, because she appeals to the right for some reasons, she appeals to the left for other reasons. So, yeah, I think so. I mean, let's be clear. This is early days. This is day one in historic terms. But you know, she's got off to a good start, I think.
And David, you talked about her being a candidate clever enough to navigate some of these big issues. Just wondered what the evidence you thought there was for that, because some have said that she is very good with the party. She speaks clear conservative. She's she's clearly someone who's very passionate about the party itself. But some say that on a broader political stage where she has to appeal not just to her party, but to the public, she's a little shallower and there's less evidence that she has, as you described, this cleverness. I just wondered what had, in your mind, against all the other candidates, what had picked out Kemi Badenoch?
Well, for a start, I mean, she was wise enough not to try and write a lot of policy headlines on day one. I mean, what I just described to you, the state of the country and the state of the world, are a whole series of problems to which, actually, at the moment, nobody's got any answers. You know, you've got a world in which people are going populist, nationalist, protectionist. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because the past governments, and indeed the current governments, of all persuasions, have failed. They haven't answered the problems that those I outlined to you and a few more as well. And what she's doing, actually, I mean, there are too many comparisons with Thatcher, but what she's doing is something very similar to what happened in 1975. And that is we, the Conservative Party, set about finding answers to major problems of inflation, union dominance, a ruling class that saw its job as managing decline, a failure abroad against the Soviets, failure at home against the NUM, and so on. Margaret Thatcher, when she came in, didn't have the answers to all those things. She set about creating those answers and took 4 years to do it. And that's what I think Kemi will do. And I suspect in the same way, because what Thatcher did, I mean, Thatcher, remember, was a lawyer and a scientist, a little like Kemi in that respect. She set about taking every problem, which everybody thought was insoluble, and cutting it up into small bits and then solving the small bits. The easiest way to see it is with trade unions. The trade unions, Ted Heath tried to fix and he got thrown out of government. So what she do? She put in place, she dealt with the closed shop. She then dealt with union democracy. She then dealt with forcing them to have votes before ballots, before strikes. She then dealt with union finance and so on, one after another. She also dealt with the NUM along the way, the miners along the way. Piece by piece by piece, the analytic approach. Frankly, tends not to be the approach of most modern politicians. Most modern politicians, bluntly, and in my view, stupidly, look towards a polling or a focus group and say, oh, what will go down well? That isn't what's going to solve this problem. Come 4 years' time, when we go back to the polls, the public will be saying to themselves, who's got the answers to the problems that Labour haven't solved? And there'll be a lot of those, which are the problems they haven't solved. Who's got the answers that matter to me? You know, getting my mother treated properly in hospital, getting my son and daughter a house, getting them to university with a useful degree that doesn't bankrupt them in the process, dealing with the authoritarian dictatorships around the world, trying to ensure that our economic policy works well. You know, walking on the street yesterday, I think it was, just outside Parliament, I bumped into a past Labour cabinet minister. For the sake of his embarrassment, I won't tell you what he said, but he was talking about Trump. I won't tell you who he is. And he was talking about Trump, but he said, well, for a start, his protectionist policies mean our growth forecasts have gone out the window. Now, I think Labour growth forecasts were optimistic anyway, but the protectionist policies now going to be pursued by Trump, even worse than those pursued by Biden, are going to be a real problem. We've got to have an answer to that. You know, we've got to have an answer to all these things. They don't come out of headlines about, I don't know, leaving the ECHR or whatever. They come out of real analytical thought and a determined approach to policy, which I think Kemi will give us.
David, you were involved, I think, somewhat younger politician, involved in those discussions with Margaret Thatcher. Can you just take us back about what that was like going through some of those processes with her and what lessons there may be from that work that you were involved in as a young politician in the 80s, and I think possibly as a student politician in the 70s?
Yeah, well, don't overestimate it. You know, I was just either at university or at the university. I first met her when she was education secretary, and I was a student leader, and I used to meet her about a dozen times a year then. Well, the first thing to say is that she looked around for answers. It wasn't just her. I mean, one tends to forget that the Thatcher revolution was also the Keith Joseph revolution, was also the Willie Whitelaw revolution, was also the Peter Walker, the Peter Carrington, the Nigel Lawson revolution. The ideas came from everywhere. She, in the first instance, looked at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was the great venerable think tank, really, which argued against the established ruling conventional wisdom at the time. She created the Centre for Policy Studies to create more to turn that into practical policies, if you like, because the IEA is very theoretical in its approach. She then, as I say, created a series of ideas that they ran with, and most of the ideas were cut up into little elements, as I described, but some of them were quite dramatic in their own right. As it were, the liberation of the exchange rate. You know, you're too young to remember. In those days, we were only allowed to take £50 abroad if we went on holiday. You know, the exchange rate was pinned. She had to liberate all that at once. That's quite a big gamble, but she did it. Other more domestic, more populist policies, I guess, was the sale of council houses. Now, you know, we tend to view that as a sort of right-wing policy these days. You know, subsidised sale of a state asset, a right-wing policy? No, it was just thoughtful, and it dealt with an issue and a problem that was quite important, which is we didn't have any property ownership in Britain. So this was a way of instituting it. So it was the most important thing to understand about it is how wide she cast the net in looking for new ideas. I mean, she famously in cabinet used to sometimes pull out of that infamous big handbag a little note from some professor at a university in the Midlands and introduce a new idea. And that started with her shadow cabinet. That started when she was leader of the opposition. Also remember, at the time, you know, you say Kemi doesn't appeal to the populace. I think that will alter over time if you're right. But, you know, Margaret Thatcher's nickname when she took the leadership of the opposition was Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher. She wasn't exactly that popular at the time, but she built a huge respect for being able to come up with the answers to problems that people really cared about. And that's where I think Kemi's going to go to.
David, that's going to take time. Will the party give her that time, given that there are local elections coming up in May? It's possible Reform might do very well in those. You've got more local elections a year after. The Tories have a track record of getting rid of leaders pretty swiftly if they think that they're not going in the right direction. Will she be given that time to do what she needs to do, given that the election is still 5 years away?
Yeah, well, firstly, just on mechanics. I mean, I think the answer is yes, but let me explain why. I mean, firstly, on mechanics, we have had structurally, constitutionally, a system which is almost designed against leaders. It takes a very small number. Historically, it's taken a very small number of letters to the chairman of 22, and that's been altered, been significantly increased. So that makes it more stable anyway. Secondly, she's not a partisan leader in the conventional sense of the word. She's seen as right-wing, which I think is a simplification, but she's seen as right because she took a big lead on dealing with woke, when it was a brave thing to do. Let's not forget that. It took courage to deal with the woke onslaught a few years ago. We now all are in the same place as she was then. But on the other hand, something like the ECHR demonstrates quite clearly that she doesn't just grab at a right-wing solution now, or a nominally right-wing solution. I consider myself a right-winger, and I don't agree with it either. But the other thing is, I think the party won't expect her to instantly transform our fortunes from the worst position, well, in history really, since we created as a party, to suddenly massive victories in the short term. I think the first time that will matter will not be the next one. It'll be the election after that, when she's had time to establish herself.
The local election after that.
Sorry?
The local election.
The local election after that. So not 2025, 2026, I think would be the first real test of it, to be honest. But the other thing is, that process of generating new ideas, that reaching out to people, is going to be of itself is going to be a unifying effect. It's going to pull people together. It's going to make people, I think, more interested in her leadership, more invested in her leadership. Also, the other thing, which is astonishing, frankly, is that this government has had the worst start of any government, certainly post-war. I'm not sufficient of a historian to know whether ones pre-war have been as bad as this, but it's the worst, certainly in my lifetime. And if you had asked me on July 5th and given me a truth drug, I would have said we were out for 10 years, right? Now, I think there's a reasonable chance of us overthrowing them in one term, in 4 years. And I think that view is becoming widespread inside the parliamentary party, and probably in the party in the country. I can't test that yet, but I suspect the same is true there. And that of itself will bind together, because everybody now knows after the demonstration of the last election, I mean, a lot of people blame, because it suits their book, the last election on our immigration policy. Actually, it's much more about the infighting. It's much more about the visible division. That's what I heard on the doorsteps 5 times for every once I heard immigration during the election campaign. People know that. The party knows that. The survivors of the MPs know that. And they'll know that if they start trying to have a civil war in 2 years' time, they're destining themselves to another term of opposition. So for all sorts of reasons, Gordon, I think there are both structural and leadership reasons that we won't have the infighting that is implicit in your question.
How should she deal with Nigel Farage, given that events across the Atlantic are surely only going to boost the popularity of the reform agenda? And aren't the Conservatives going to need to think carefully about how they deal with those voters so disillusioned with the Conservative offer, and frankly, any offer from any of the other parties, that they are now backing Nigel Farage?
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, it's not within our power to nominate him to be ambassador to Washington, so that option is not available. Well, the first thing he shouldn't do is what he wants us to do, which is to try and sort of outbid him on the right, because he knows that he can always keep going further to the right than we will. Secondly, the thing to understand is exactly why we did as badly as we did. And I've sort of given you the answer to that, which is division and apparent perceived incompetence. I mean, listen, on the doorstep, the response was in June and July, was a plague on all your houses. They didn't like anybody. They thought nobody had the answer. And indeed, I think that's even true in the States. If you read some of the data coming back from the polling organizations and some of the anecdotal data as well, it's, do you think anybody's got the answer to all the problems? No, was the sort of typical response coming back. And our answer is to have the answer to the problems, is to answer. I mean, my advice to her, and it's advice I've given her and given to some of her supporters, is look, what we've got to do in the next few years is look at where Labour fails, and there will be lots of places they will fail, both in the areas which are traditionally our strengths, but also in the areas that are their strengths too. I mean, I expect them not to be able to solve the problems of the NHS, for example, which is front and centre to what they're trying to do. Look at the areas where they fail, which matter to the public. They aren't always the same thing. What matters to journalists isn't always what matters to the public. Look where they fail, which matters to the public, and provide new answers there. That's actually the answer both to the Labour Party and to reform. It's not an ideological answer. It's because most of the public are not ideological. 80% of the public are floating voters in this day and age, I'm afraid. And they're floating voters because they don't think the ruling establishment, or what counts as the ruling establishment, has come up with answers. That's why we've got this populist, nationalist, protectionist surge across the whole world, from Eastern Europe to the States, and that's so the solution to that is finding answers. It's not shifting right or left depending on where you are.
David, obviously Kemi Badenoch is very much learning on the job. What does she need to get better at?
That's an interesting question. Foreseeing difficult headlines in answers to questions. It's an instinct you acquire. I mean, let me give you an example. On Sunday last week, being interviewed by Laura Kuenssberg, she was answering straightforwardly and honestly, and she was asked a bit, I think implicitly, about the Boris time, and she said Boris was a good prime minister, but Partygate, what was the word she used?
Overblown, she said.
Overblown, that's the word. What she was driving at, which was actually fundamentally important and fundamentally right, was that Partygate arose because we were doing distinctly unconservative things, putting up drones to watch people walking their dogs, and then imposing fines on them. And that's just one. I mean, the excessive lockdowns, you name it, there's all sorts of things we did which we shouldn't have done. And when we then didn't obey those rules, which we shouldn't have put in the first place, we got punished, quite rightly, in my view, for it. So, but the headline came out of it, Boris, I've forgotten, it was Boris was a great prime minister, and it was overblown, and the Partygate was overblown, which was not the central point she was making. But she does this quite a lot. She says exactly what's front and center of her mind. That's one of her abiding virtues, in my view. Sometimes the headline that comes out of it isn't necessarily the one she wanted. Leaders of parties learn this. They all of them learn it, and she'll learn it. It's more important to her because she puts a great premium on being honest and straightforward, but she has to be honest and straightforward in a way which just doesn't make you guys a gift every so often.
No, but does she not does she not need to learn to have the courage of her convictions a bit more, and just to actually back up what she says, rather than trying to pretend that she didn't say it in the first place? Kamal and I were talking earlier about maternity pay, for example, where she said something which clearly she believed, that maternity pay was excessive, and then she tried to sort of say, no, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean that. Would she not be better just to say, well, yes, I do think that, and here's why?
Well, I wasn't actually on the. I was a supporter, but I wasn't a member of the inner leadership teams. I have no idea what advice she's given, but I can imagine every person around the table say, "Oh, for heaven's sake, get off it, get off it." And I think it's a bit of an error to judge her by behaviour in the middle of a leadership campaign. Leadership campaigns are very odd things, and I don't think people's behaviour in them is necessarily entirely a guide to the future. She's always been very forthright, and the best test of this was not a throwaway line in a leadership campaign. It was during that big battle over woke issues, where it was a fierce debate. It was a no holds barred debate, and at one point she was pretty much the only person in mainstream politics that was taking it head on. And she did so day after day, week after week, month after month. I don't think of all the people in Parliament you could accuse Kemi of not having the courage of convictions. Just the reverse. I think that's one of her attractive features. Now, look, she's not the fully formed article any more than Margaret Thatcher was in 1975, or indeed David Cameron was in 2005. She's not the fully formed article, and there will be lessons learned along the way. But that's the point. I mean, we're not talking about tomorrow's cabinet. We're not talking about tomorrow's prime minister. We're talking about a prime minister in 4 years' time. By which time I think you'll see she'll be dominating the debate, and you won't be asking questions about standing by her convictions at all. You'll be saying, will these policies work? Will the new answers that we come up with deliver, and will the public believe in them? And I think the answer to all of those things will be yes.
Do you think that the people that she's appointed into her shadow cabinet have taken on board the points you make about having a broad number of people of high intellect that can help her formulate the policies that make a programme for government? She's got Chris Philp, Mel Stride. Chris Philp is the Shadow Home Secretary, Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, Priti Patel, Shadow Foreign Secretary. Those are kind of three big officers of state, and the ones that will probably make most noise or have most ability to make noise over the next few years. Interestingly, Chris Philp and Mel Stride both voted Remain. Of course, Priti Patel, a very strong Brexit campaigner. Are they going to be good enough to do the type of work that, as you say, Sir Keith Joseph, Willie Whitelaw, so many people around Margaret Thatcher had obviously had big jobs in government and were huge intellectual figures in their own right? Douglas Hurd, Michael Heseltine. Are this group going to be able to help Kemi Badenoch get to where she needs to get to?
Well, interestingly, I work for Douglas. I think he was the last great foreign secretary, in truth. I think he was a really, really smart man, but it wasn't that clear back in 1975, I promise you. The demands of each job are a bit different. Clearly, the economics is going to be front and centre to this, and the Labour Party economic policy is going to fail in a fairly predictable way. They're going to try and copy some of the Gordon Brown issues. Gordon Rayner will have lots of fun with their attempt to resurrect PFI, for example, I imagine, when it comes along. Yep. So I think Mel will do the sort of homework on that, and that's an area which requires. I remember our lead thinker really in that area back in the Thatcher's day, was Geoffrey Howe. Thorough, slightly boring, but determinedly intellectually dissecting that. Home Affairs is a bit different. Shadow Home Secretary is a very peculiar job. I've filled it myself, and to a very large extent, being Home Secretary is the most dangerous job in government. And that's very much a function of what the Shadow Home Secretary is like. I mean, remember Jack Straw saying to me, he went to bed every night when he was Home Secretary, knowing that about a dozen people in his department finish his career the next day, right? But actually making that happen, as we did back in David Cameron's day, we removed Beverly Hughes, we removed David Blunkett, we removed Charles Clarke. John Reed went in 6 months, albeit of his own accord. Is down to knowing how the Home Office works, knowing the wiring, knowing where the weaknesses are, and then being, assiduous at demonstrating where the government's got it wrong. And they're going to get lots of this wrong. They already are. I mean, look at what's happening on the illegal immigration front. Which Starmer made so much of. It's already going wrong. Their immigration policies, I mean, they're probably again going to follow Gordon Brown and try and bolster growth with immigration. He did it rather insidiously back in the 90s and 2000s. And Philp's got to be across that. Now, Philp's been in the Home Office, so it's he'll know that wiring pretty well. And it's the sort of thing he does. I mean, he is a detail man. He will go for that. And Pretty again is another brave politician, and she's very good at putting very clear points across. Sometimes under high controversy, we're going to see a lot of that in foreign affairs. Now, I don't think foreign affairs actually alters the balance of power much in British politics. Slight exception to that on Gaza, but generally,
Ukraine, David, Ukraine is going to be, and Putin, and that's going to be, given where Trump might go, Priti Patel's going to, she's going to have to think through that position.
Yeah, but I don't think there's much. I agree with you on Trump, and I mean, I think the issue with Trump is going to be more about, from our point of view, directly is going to be more about NATO and to some extent about Ukraine. So it's going to be a defence issue as much as a foreign issue. But within British politics, there's not much divide on Ukraine. I think we're all pretty much in the same place of wanting to support Zelensky as best we can. And Priti won't have to be defending Trump's policy; she'll be defending ours and putting pressure on the government. But I don't think that'll be a problem. The area which may be more controversial, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out in foreign affairs. Will be how Starmer delivers on his attempted closer arrangements with Europe, because in one sense, closer arrangements with Europe are just common sense. They're a nearby trading partner, but the trade-off that they do will be incredibly important. If it's about, I don't know, agreeing regulation for steel, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. If it's giving way to general purpose regulation, that's a different matter altogether. And, that's throwing away what Brexit was all about. So that'll be quite complex, and it's very good that she's a determined Brexiteer, and she's a very clear public thinker. But you're right. There won't be that many shadow cabinet posts that the public are aware of. There'll be about half a dozen, and the other ones probably will be health. We've got Ed Argo, who'll be a new face, and be interesting to see how he gets on. Will probably be education, where Trott, I think, is going to be brilliant. Maybe housing might be an important one. In which case, you got Kevin Hollinrake, who's probably the most common sense member of the entire parliamentary party in terms of his approach to things. He's brilliant on the post office, for example, the way nobody else before him ever was. So, I think, and bear in mind they're also new. Bear in mind what we're looking at here is, again, I repeat the point, not tomorrow's future Conservative cabinet. It's the Conservative cabinet in 4 years. And the ones who are successful will stay. The ones who are unsuccessful, she can change. She's got 4 years. So I think it's not bad. I mean, there's been a bit of criticism in some of the newspapers, which frankly, in my view, is not very smart, not very wise, thinking, oh, well, why haven't we got Hunt? Why haven't we got Cleverly? Why haven't we got... we've come out of a government that's failed. Our economic policy in the past, whilst it was nothing like as bad as Labour tried to crack it up to be, wasn't the best conservative policy ever. Our home affairs policy, probably a significant part of not winning the election. We want new faces, we want new brains, more importantly, and we want new thinking. And I think this is a good shadow cabinet to deliver that.
Why are James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat not in the shadow cabinet, David?
Well, their own choice, I think, in both cases. I mean, I wasn't privy to the actual conversation, but what is widely rumoured, almost to the point of being a certainty in the tea room, as it were, is that both of them said they didn't want to come in. Now, in Cleverly's case, I can't really speak very well for Tom. I haven't talked to him about it, but in Cleverly's case, he's held all the high offices of state. He's of an age where he can maybe make himself another career doing other things, or just enjoy being a powerful backbencher. Don't ever underestimate what you can do from the backbenches if you put your mind to it. Tom, I don't know. It may be that Tom doesn't think the way Kemi is going to take the party suits him. Or it maybe he wants to do something else. Maybe he wants to write or do other things. I don't know. I can't speak for him. But I think for some of the older ones who said no thanks, it's because they know in 4 years' time they'll be getting on a bit. I shouldn't speak, should I really? And it may be they just want to do other things, or they're just tired. They've had long enough in office. I mean, bear in mind, being a government minister of a high rank is a very, very draining exercise. It's a 7-day-a-week, sort of 15 to 18-hour a day job sometimes, and it's high stress by definition. It's high stress every day, all the time. You're in the front line facing people like you, or you're working to try and solve problems that are sometimes nearly insoluble. So you can see why that's the case. That's just personal decisions. But I don't think the outcome is necessarily a bad one. I think people are invariably people look, oh, why has it compared with yesterday? What they should be thinking about is how will it do tomorrow, which is the real issue here.
Is it not possible that that James Cleverly is sitting it out because he thinks that if Kemi drops the ball, he may have another crack at the leadership, that he's the Rishi Sunak in this scenario?
Well, if he's thinking that, I think he's guilty of a significant miscalculation. And of course, that's invariably. I mean, political commentators spend a lot of their time sort of looking at the sort of machinations, and sometimes lose sight of the long view. And they're also inclined to say, oh, will the same happen this time as last time? Given we're a party that's gone through Lord knows how many leaders in a relatively short time, it's an understandable error. But I don't think it's by any means the likely outcome. I think the sort of 90% probability is that we are going to see broadly the same shadow cabinet, broadly, I can't talk for detail, in 4 years as we're facing now. I think what we're looking at is what we're going to the next election with, and that'll be a good thing. I mean, bear in mind, we haven't always been quite so regicidal as we've been in the last few years, and I think the Tory party has a very strong sense of self-preservation, and one part of that self-preservation will be getting itself re-elected, and they won't do that if they start killing each other.
David Davis, from your rather beautiful study, is that in your constituency?
Yep.
Thank you so much for many wise words. We hope Kemi Badenoch listens to all of them. Thanks for joining the Daily Tea.